In this video, I'm going to be making a diorama of a duck approaching Arromanches Beach on June the 6th, 1944. And while I set out with good intentions, I do think I bit off more than I could chew. I'm James, and you're watching LPJ Models. My mate Rico recently got in touch and asked if I wanted to be part of an upcoming show in the Netherlands. Effectively, I'd build a kit, send it over to the Netherlands, and take part in the show on their club stand. And never one to back down from a challenge or a bit of fun, I agreed. The show was Euro scale modelling in Houten, just outside of Utrecht, in the Netherlands, on the 23rd of November. And the show reports looked fantastic. It looked like a really busy show with loads of quality work for everybody to see. And the club I was representing was ModelBouw Groep, Sprues and Glues. This talented group of modellers meet up in Nieuw-Vennep on a Thursday evening. Check out the links in the description for their Facebook and Instagram pages. And if you're in the area, why not head along? As I was saying, they are a very talented group of modellers, and here are some shots of their display table from the Euroscale modelling show. And as you can probably tell, the theme was D-Day. Before we get into the build, I want to give a big thanks to Rico for getting me involved, and I want to congratulate you on your Halifax and Horsa. They look really good, and it was really worth the effort you put in. Right, should we do some building? For the subject for this ocean-going diorama, scene, vignette, whatever, we're going to need a kit, and for that kit I'm using the Italeri Duck in 1/72 scale. The kit was originally tooled in 2004, but this is a much more recent boxing. Some of the details are a little bit oversimplified, but overall the parts look pretty nice. Let's just hope it doesn't fit like a normal Italeri kit, because in my experience in the past, they've been pretty gappy. Anyway, as you're seeing on screen, the parts were removed from their sprues with my godhand sprue cutters, and any sprue nubs were cleaned up with a scalpel and a sanding stick. The construction started with the hull tub, which comes in several parts, and this is pulled together to form a box shape, consisting of the top, the bottom and the sides. I thought this area would be quite problematic, but in reality there were only a few small areas to fill on the underside, so I was pleasantly surprised. And as a quick note, all the glue for the plastic parts is VMS fast setting styrene cement. I just decant it into a different bottle with a brush. Even though the fit is fairly good with these parts, you do need to be careful lining them up, just to make sure all the edges are nice and straight. And being careful with assembly throughout the build is a good way of making sure no mistakes pile up and cause problems further down the line. The instrument panels and controls were fairly simple. As in detail, the assembly was fine, but the detail was fairly light. But at this scale, and with the fact that the cabin would have 2 figures in it, I wasn't too bothered. Once the main tub and the cabin was done, it was time to start adding some of the details around the body of the vehicle. For the most part, the construction of this is easy enough, but in some areas, the instructions are quite vague. For example, the surround for the truck bed didn't quite fit where I expected it to, and the instruction illustrations don't quite match up with the parts. So for the sidewalls specifically, a little bit of guesswork or checking references is required. These parts also have the most prominent ejector pin marks on the kit. For the most part, ejector pin marks are almost non-existent, but for these sidewalls specifically, on such a visible open-backed vehicle, they needed to be dealt with. Some sprue goo and some sanding soon sorted that out. I searched far and wide for some figures for this vehicle. I needed some Brits, or at least Commonwealth troops, and a driver, and they were pretty much non-existent, so I put up a call for help on Facebook. And one of my friends, Aid, came back to me with a recommendation of some metal figures from Eureka Miniatures, as their selection was quite broad. So I found this set, and it's supposed to be a British kangaroo crew at rest, but it had a few figures in poses that I could use. So thanks for the recommendation, Aid, you helped move this build along. Much appreciated, mate. I don't think I've painted a metal figure for a long time, but the detail looks alright for 1/72, so I'm looking forward to painting these up. And the reason I bought these figures up now is that I needed to do some modifications to them to make sure they fit in the vehicle. For example, the driver is sitting on a fairly large chunk of white metal, so that will need to be removed. But being white metal, I'm pretty sure I'm going to wear out some tools chipping away at some of this metal. I started with my CMK razor saw, but I soon realised I needed to bring out the big guns. But annoyingly, I only had a fine grit bit for my rotary tool. But it did help towards removing some of the casting block, or seat, or whatever it was supposed to be. And because the vehicle was open-topped and the figure was missing two quite vital components, I had to scratch build some legs. For the legs I started with some armatures made from 0.6mm brass wire. These were popped into two pre-drilled holes and then covered in green stuff. I haven't really sculpted anything before, so if this doesn't look quite up to scratch, you'll have to forgive me for being a beginner. Most of the sculpting was done with a toothpick. As long as I got some realistic looking folds in there, I'd be happy. This was actually quite fun to do, so I might try some more figure conversions in future. I found in the past when working with green stuff that extra thin glue works really well as a smoothener. I know that's not a word, but you know what I mean. If you brush it over the sculpted parts, it'll help to soften and blend in any marks that you don't want. Sort of like dissolving the outer layer of the putty. I then cut some feet off one of the other figures. I didn't really think I had the skills to sculpt some boots, and pop these onto the bottom of my man's little leggies. And I think that's good enough. And of course I had to check he fit nicely into the position I wanted before I could move on with the rest of the build. Moving to the underside of the duck, there are two options for the suspension and wheels. You've got a simplified version for wargaming or a more detailed version if it's a static model, and I went for the more detailed version. This is probably the most complicated construction of the entire kit, but it still is fairly simple. Just take your time here and study the instructions and you'll have no problems. I left the wheels off for painting, and the wheels is the only area where the kit really falls short because the backs are hollow. To make the bumpers on the kit look more realistic, I added some ropes of scale rope, so that they weren't just hanging in thin air. For this I had to carefully drill some holes into the plastic parts and glue in the rope with super glue. I did have to touch up a few parts with green stuff too, because some of the joints on some of the parts didn't look very natural. As this model is for a D-Day diorama, the duck needs to be carrying something, so I compiled a selection of files that I bought and scaled them to 1/72 if they weren't already, and printed out a boatload, pun intended, of stowage parts that I could pop in the back. These were printed on my Saturn IV Ultra with a mix of water washable and standard resin, because sadly I only had a few drops of water washable left and it's my resin of choice. I also replaced the kit moulded jerry cans, which were pretty rubbish, with some 3D printed ones. All the stowage was then arranged nicely in the back. I built these up in a few modular blocks so they'd be nice and easy to paint. I tried to get in a nice variety of stowage for some visual interest. And I think I got the balance right. Hopefully. Alongside the 3D printed parts, I'll be adding some tarps too, to add some more interest. And for the tarps, of course, I'm using regular note paper with VMS paper shaper. I decanted some paper shaper into a small plastic container and dipped in the note paper. It's then wrapped around the parts, and the paper is tweaked and titivated until it looks nicely folded. The nice thing about paper shaper is it doesn't deteriorate the paper like water or PVA would. It seems to maintain a lot of its integrity, making folding easier, although you do still have to be careful, we are dealing with slightly damp paper. But it is a little bit tougher overall, and a bit more forgiving. And fabric items and tarps and the like can add a lot of life to a vehicle or scene. And this was done not just for the barrels, but for a few areas of the stowage too. And with the stowage done, let's get on with the painting. And being at the start of the painting, it's time to prime. Just like Model Minutes has stated on one of his newly released t-shirts. Anyway, my primer of choice this time was Mr. Surfacer 1500 Mahogany. Brown worked really successfully for my Stuart, so I thought it was the perfect base for olive drab again, this time. This was thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner at a ratio of about 60% thinner to 40% primer. And all painting is being done with my 0.15 Hardering Steenbeck. Of course the figures get some primer too, as also does the stowage, making sure every angle is covered so paint can grip better later on. And talking of colour, I wanted to use a slightly different olive green for this vehicle. On the box art, the British version has got a slightly more blue tinge. I started off with a base of MRP RAL 6003 olive green, and then to shift the colour more towards a blue tone, I used some MRP RAF marking blue, just about 5 to 10% just to shift the tone of the green. I then used a high-tech mixing method to mix the colours together. And it's time to lay this colour down. I used smooth, thin, wet coats to build this green up to opacity. making sure to spray slowly and evenly. Instead of using a black basing method, I'm going to do some shading and highlighting over the base coat. I still rank MRP among my favourite paints for spraying. It's tough and it sprays beautifully. Also, quite often you don't need to thin it to spray it, so that's a plus in my lazy book. I next applied some post shading using a mix of red, brown and black MRP colours, highly thinned. I'm talking like 90% thinner. And this was sprayed around all of the details on the model, and in any areas that might get more shadow. To add some visual interest to the truck bed, I also did some light modulation, as this area was quite vast and flat and pretty dull looking, even if it was going to be covered with stowage later. The shading was carried around the body of the vehicle, paying particular attention to underneath the ridges on the vehicle sides. These are the perfect place for some forced artificial shadows. Next up, it was time to add some highlights, and for this I mixed up a lighter version of my original green, lightening my green-blue mix with a drop of RLM02, just to keep the desaturated greeny-grey look. I did sadly lose some of the blue tone, but that's not the end of the world. And with the shading done, it was time to paint some of those details. I started this with the tyres, and I used AK 3rd Gen black mixed with just a touch of brown, just so they didn't look too stark. But because the tyres were going to be wet, they still needed to be quite dark. The bumpers were then base coated with German Sea Beige World War II from Vallejo. This is the perfect base colour on which to add some highlighting and shadows later. I will though probably keep things simple with a dry brush and some oil shading. And that was pretty much it for the detail painting on the vehicle. So I glued the wheels in place and brought all the other small details together before adding the decals. I haven't yet painted the stowage yet, I just wanted to finish the vehicle first. There weren't many decals to add, and they were printed by Cartograph, so I had high hopes. They were given a layer of VMS decal set and fix for extra adhesion, and popped directly onto the paint. The extra adhesive in the VMS decal set and fix will help alleviate any silvering. The decals for this kit were of a nice quality. They were all in register and they were all really thin, which is what I'd hoped from a Cartograph set. Some of the smaller decals took a little bit of tweaking to get into the correct position, but these were just zhuzhed around with a brush or a scalpel until they were in the right spot. Once the decals on the top were done, it was time to move on to the tactical markings on the side. I think these black blocks with white lettering look quite striking, and make a nice change from the usual US schemes that you see. Once they had dried, about maybe an hour later, they were hit with a layer of VMS decal softener. It's not essential for the top flat one, but I do like to add a layer to make sure they bed down nicely. Areas where this is more essential is on the sides where there are some complex shapes for the decals to conform to, just making sure the decals are tucked into those sharp corners. Once they had all dried, they were given a layer of VMS matte varnish. This will help to flatten the entire surface, as a matte varnish would, but it also hides the raised edges of the decal carrier film, making them blend more naturally into the surface. It's time now to start detail painting some of that stowage, and to start off I painted all the wooden areas, carefully with my airbrush with MRP's Pale Wood. Bigger areas of green were then painted with some various olive green colours, and on top of that different elements of the stowage were picked out further with more varied greens, using a mix of Vallejo and AK 3rd Gen. The wooden crates were then given a wash/glaze of oil paints to emulate wood grain. I didn't go too crazy with wood grain effects here, because it is 1/72nd scale. Next up, it's time to tackle some light weathering on the vehicle. The weathering would only be light because it's A, in a wet environment, and 2, a fairly new vehicle. So some light sponge chipping and some washes would probably be enough. For the chipping, I dabbed on some VMS Chip and Nick. I used a red-brown colour and a grey-brown colour to mix up a sort of worn steel. The stowage was then carefully glued into place. I just used a white glue here for setting time and ease of cleanup. I think this is really starting to come together. Let's add a little bit more depth with some oil washes. I started by adding some shading with a mix of Abteilung 502, Field Grey and Starship Filth. Just an extra dark green colour to add some more depth and variation to the finish. This was thinned with VMS Universal Weather and Carrier Light and brushed around the majority of the green details on the vehicle. And apart from some very topical and tactical black washes, that was it for the oil work. Next up, I painted the figures. I sadly didn't get a lot of this on film because it was quite small and fiddly, and I'm starting to think I might need reading glasses for detail work, because I am finding it harder to paint detail and film at the same time. They were painted overall with Vallejo's English uniform, airbrushed, thinned with some VMS airbrush thinner, and then the flesh tones were carefully picked out. I started with quite a rosy base tone before adding some quite pale highlights. At this scale, to see the detail you need to exaggerate it a little bit, even more so than say 1/35. But after some back and forwards with some shadows and highlights, I got to a flesh tone that I was happy with. And it was then time to start work on the uniform. For some variation, I painted this guy's helmet in quite a vibrant green, and started to bring out the shadows and highlights on the uniform. For the highlights, I mixed in some German sea beige World War II with my English uniform, and for the shadows added a touch of grey-black. And over a few hours, these figures started to really come to life. For the webbing, I used some of the shades from my recently acquired AK 3rd Gen US Army paint set. I needed to be really careful with the details, and spent a lot of time and care making sure that they were up to scratch. The figures were then carefully glued into place with some super glue. And the build of the duck was pretty much complete. It's now time for the most daunting part of this build, the diorama. The first step was to make the sandy seafloor base, and to do this I needed to mix up quite a few ingredients. I started with some VMS diorama textures. I used fine grey sand, desert sand and stones and red gravel. That should add enough variation to the base. So these were all dumped in varying amounts into my mixing pot before I added some pigment for colour. The colour was made up with EU Dark Earth and Sand pigments from VMS. This will help in tinting the plaster of Paris to a sandy shade. Then several dollops of plaster was added to my mix. I needed quite a bit as I needed to fill the entire bottom of the silicone mould I bought off of Amazon. For added structural integrity, a whole heap of PVA or wood glue was added to the mix. This stops the plaster from becoming too brittle and helps to bind some of the other ingredients together. It also makes it less likely for the pigments to rub off when you touch the part. Finally, I added in some water and this was carefully mixed up. My plaster mix was then poured into the bottom of the mould. It was spread around carefully to make sure it covered the entire bottom. Once it was smooth and left to dry, I needed to make some small accessories, just to add a bit of life. To start with, I made some seaweed. I mixed up a paste with some AK water gel and some green and brown acrylics. This was painted on a piece of packing film, in the rough shapes that you'd expect seaweed to be, albeit a little out of scale. These wiggly lines were carefully brushed onto the plastic and then left to dry. I then ended up with quite a convincing sheet of seaweed. All I needed to do was peel it off and it was ready. I needed a log ramp for this diorama, so I made one in Blender and printed it on my Saturn IV Ultra. I did model on some wood grain, but at this scale it's really hard to see, so I added some more with some slightly dried out Mr. Surfacer. Oh, and in case you're interested, I'll be making the log ramp available on my Cults 3D page when this video is released. Just search Les Paul James on Cults 3D. The log ramp was then primed with Mr. Surfacer mahogany, and I needed to add some life and texture to this wooden item. So to start with, I stippled on a variety of wood colours with a piece of sponge. I then added some very transparent lines of acrylic paint, again to add more texture and make the wood look more realistic. I then added some algae to the log ramp. For this I used AK's Moss Deposits. This was brushed on and then stippled with a sponge to blend it in. The metal items were given a rusty patina using oils and pigments. We all know salt water abrades metal quite aggressively, so I thought this was the right thing to do. I then stuck on some seaweed to my log ramp, mainly in areas where I thought it would grow or collect. I thought this came out quite well, so I was pretty pleased at this point. I also printed out some sea life like crabs and some starfish and a few other accessories like this anchor to go on the sea floor. At this point I was hoping that these would be visible in the diorama, but sadly this wasn't to be the case, and you'll find out why in a bit. All the parts were stuck onto the base with PVA glue. I didn't want it to be just a plain sand base, so I needed some things to add some life and variety. The concept was that this was very slightly offshore and the tide was in. Oh, here are some of the starfish I printed. They look pretty neat, and some of these details are absolutely minuscule. The last thing to be put into place was this tiny crab, just on top of the log ramp so you can still see him. Right, let's add some water to this dio, shall we? Because the duck is supposed to be floating, I need a layer at the bottom, maybe a centimetre thick, to lift the duck off of the sea floor. I estimated that I need around 300 ml of resin just to get it to this level. The resin, just some stuff off Amazon, was carefully mixed in a 1:1 ratio, and to do this I used a scale to make sure it was accurate. The last thing I wanted was to pour some resin and for it not to cure properly. So I did take a lot of care in this stage, just to make sure it worked. The resin was followed by some hardener, bringing the total up to 300-ish ml. I then added some tints to the resin, using Tamiya clear colours. I mainly used Tamiya clear blue and clear yellow. I then added a drop of Vallejo's old wood to add some murk, and the colours and the resin and hardener were thoroughly mixed. There wasn't quite enough colour in this mix, so I added a touch more. And this mix was poured into the base and over all of those details. Once I'd poured the resin, I put it somewhere flat to cure and covered it with a Tupperware container, just to make sure it didn't pick up any dust. After 24 hours, it was time to put the duck in place. I didn't want the duck to sit flat though, so I used some UV resin to add some little spacers under one side of the wheels and make it look more like it was bobbing. The UV resin was dabbed into place with a toothpick and then cured with a UV light. Once it was cured, it was popped onto place on the diorama, and it was time for my second resin pour. This was about 1 centimetre thick to bring it to just below the waterline on the vehicle. It's looking a bit radioactive at the moment. When pouring this resin, I made a few questionable choices. I knew the concept, but I hadn't done it before, and practice makes perfect. Once this layer had dried, I needed to make the next layer, quite a thin layer, to a more blue-grey shade to emulate the colour of the surface you see of the Atlantic. And this is where I made quite a big mess of everything. It's time for the big mistake. So I needed a darker layer to simulate the grey-blue of the visible section of the Atlantic you see. So I mixed some black into my mix, and for some reason, when I was mixing my dark colour, I added some black, and then I added some more black, and I kept on going. And then I poured it on the diorama, and in the back of my mind, I knew this was stupid, but I did it anyway. And I carried on pouring, and pouring, until it was at the right level. If this project wasn't for the ModelBouw Groep Sprues and Glues and the Euroscale modelling show, at this point I probably would have put it in the bin. But let's see if we can turn this around. It doesn't look too bad, really, ish. Okay, maybe it does. I don't know, but I'm going to have to work with it. First up, we're going to need some texture on the surface of the sea. You know, waves and stuff. So for this, I'm using AK Atlantic Blue Water Gel. This was brushed on quite thickly to emulate the ebb and flow of the Atlantic. It was quite simply plopped on and brushed into a shape that I wanted. A few dips, a few waves, and some churny back stuff. And once I'd finished with it, it looked a bit like this. Even without the dark underside, it does have quite an ultramarine tint, which is nothing like the advertising on AK's website. I didn't expect it to be exactly the same, but come on. So the colours of the gel weren't working, so I had to mix up some greys and blues of my own. So I used a selection of Vallejo colours and got painting. It took me several goes to come up with a colour palette that I was happy with. I used plenty of photos for reference, and whatever I was chucking at it didn't sit right. I ended up using mainly a mix of dark Prussian blue, grey and white. I did mix it with some of the AK gel to add some sheen, and that's why it looks really light in these pictures. I also used these layers to build up some more bulk and body to the waves. I ended up with a nice colour sea base, so it's time to add some foam and froth effects with AK water gel effects. This was brushed on with a hog hair fan brush to get that bubbly and textured look of broken water. This was quite a fun segment of the water base, and I really feel like things are coming together a little bit better. There's still a 3-4mm dark blue stripe around the base, but I can probably live with that. Anyway, this frothy texture mix was stippled all over the base, and I think it looks really cool. Let's see what it looks like when it's dry. Oh, that's another fail for AK Water products. Looking at the advertising, you'd expect it to be white, or at least a lot more frothy, but it turns out it's just clear. I hate to bag on a company, but this is pretty poor. Look, there's even a picture of foam in the advertising. Come on guys. Anyway, the sea wasn't quite as lustrous as I would have liked, so I gave it a thick layer of Aqua Magic. This is before trying the foam again, because I'm going to have to fix that. I think I threw pretty much every water product I have in my arsenal at this diorama. The clock was ticking and I was panicking and I just wanted it to be right. This looks okay, so let's add some more foam. This time I mixed in some cool white Vallejo model colour to the AK water texture effects. This was quite hard to gauge how it would dry because the AK water effects were quite white when they were drying, so I had to build it up in several light layers to make sure I had the correct opacity of white that I wanted. Again, I used the fan brush and plenty of stippling. And once again, this was quite a fun step. And I'm hoping this time the end result will be more satisfying. And I'm happy to report that this time it was. All that's left to add is some water and splash effects on the duck. Again for this I used Aqua Magic from Dulux Materials and finished up with some more frothy foam. And that concludes my build of the 1/72nd scale Italeri duck and my rather disaster-ridden water base. I'd like to give a huge thanks to my Patreons for supporting my work and being patient. We haven't had a video out in a while. Thank you guys, your support is much appreciated. And I'd like to thank Rico for getting me involved in the project, and for suggesting the duck and the water base. It didn't quite go to plan, but I did get a reasonable result in the end. And while this isn't my proudest or best work, I don't think so anyway. At least I tried something new. It was a bit of an adventure with ups and downs. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe and like and all of the good stuff that helps keep this channel running. Anyway, I'm James from LPJ Models. I'll leave you with the final gallery images. Thank you for watching.